Hello everyone, and welcome to my review for Songs of Silence. I'm your host, Colors Fade. I first want to take a minute to thank the developer, Chimera Entertainment, for reaching out to me to provide me with the key for this game and the newly released DLC, Light Eaters. Songs of Silence is a very unique take on the classic Heroes of Might and Magic genre. It incorporates art that is heavily inspired by Art Nouveau, a style that was popularized during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Video games have a long history of trying to set themselves apart by utilizing unique art direction, but I've never seen a game adopt Art Nouveau as its style, and I have to say it's a fantastic way to bring a fantasy game to life. Every piece of art in this game is amazing and really helps establish the mood and tone. I'm a big fan of beautiful games, and Songs of Silence is definitely one of the best in this regard. But of course, being pretty isn't enough. A game has to be engaging and fun too. And when it comes to the time-honored mechanics of the Heroes of Might and Magic genre, Chimera Entertainment tries to set themselves apart with some other changes that kind of work, but might need a little more refinement. Songs of Silence sticks to the tried and true turn-based exploration with heroes and their armies, which is what we're all accustomed to in these games, but then it combines that with real-time battles. And this is where the game departs from most others of this type, where battles typically play out in turn-based mode as well. Initially, I wasn't sure I liked this design. I tend to prefer turn-based modes for battles simply because I like the added strategy of positioning units, employing flanking tactics, and micromanaging my spells and skills for optimal results. However, it didn't take long for me to understand and even appreciate why Chimera chose this design. Quite often in these sorts of games, battles can drag on in turn-based mode. That causes many players to opt for an auto-resolve solution instead, at least when they have powerful enough armies and heroes to guarantee positive results. I know I'm guilty of doing this, as anyone can attest from my recent play of Conquest of Io. I tend to favor the turn-based battles in the early game, where micromanagement often produces better results, but once I have a powerful enough doom stack to assure victory, I'll switch to using the auto-resolve option instead, because it's faster. And while this does speed up the game for the player, it effectively eliminates a feature that developers have spent a lot of time and energy creating. I'm sure developers aren't keen to build and test a feature only to have players ignore it. So if you're a developer, you might ask the question, how do we get the player to engage in the battle system without causing long, drawn-out affairs that make people want to auto-resolve them? And the answer is real-time battles that are quick and snappy. As it turns out, this is a fair compromise, but I think Chimera's implementation could use some work. Each hero in the game possesses a handful of abilities that they can utilize during combat, which are represented as cards they can play, each with its own cooldown timer. This is a nice, clean system and I liked using it, but the way it's set up, there's almost never a reason not to play a card the split second its cooldown expires. And because of that, there are no real tactics a player can employ to make a difference. Battles simply become a matter of playing a card the second it comes off cooldown, with the only real tactical choices being where these abilities will land on the battlefield. So while the real-time battles are snappy, this is still a pretty thin strategic layer, and I found myself wanting more. The easiest way I can explain this is that I think most of us who have played these sorts of games have run into situations where we've been faced with a tough battle that we've lost, and afterward, we've reloaded the save and tried again with different tactics. Maybe we tried different positioning, or prioritizing different enemies, or utilizing different types of attacks, or focusing on a different kind of elemental attack. Those tactical choices can end up making all the difference, and we're able to turn defeat into victory. But that's just not the case with Songs of Silence. There's no real reason to hold back on using ability cards once their cooldown expires. So every battle plays out more or less exactly the same. Reloading and trying different tactics doesn't make much of a difference because there isn't much the player can do differently, since the ability card cooldowns are what dictate the flow of battle. Positioning of your units before a fight matters a little bit, and prioritizing targets can make a small difference, but nothing really matters enough for tactical choices to produce a significant change in the outcome. There just aren't enough tactical levers for the player to pull to turn defeat into victory. When faced with a tough opponent, the only real option is to bring in a second army and tag team the enemy. No amount of tactical finesse and smart ability deployment will change the outcome. So while I found this system of combat to be slick and easy to learn, I felt like it could have used a lot more tactical depth. Songs of Silence possesses both single-player and multiplayer modes. However, for the purposes of this review, I only touch the single-player side because, as many of you know, I don't care about multiplayer. So my review is focused entirely on the single-player options. And there are a lot of them. First, there's the campaign, which is fairly lengthy and a good introduction to the game, as it features a pretty comprehensive set of tutorials along the way, especially during the first 2 scenarios. If you're new to the game, this is the first place I suggest you go. Then there are scenarios, which are self-contained maps with specific objectives that must be completed in order to unlock the next scenario. Along the way, the player can try to achieve optional objectives, which are frequently very challenging and can result in some unique rewards. Finally, there's the skirmish mode, which is basically the random map mode that most other games of this type provide, and the mode where I often spend the most time. Skirmish mode is fully customizable, as one would expect. You can choose the map size, which determines the number of enemies you'll face, the kinds of opponents you'll encounter, and these can be randomly selected or chosen by you, as well as a small set of unique limitations for each game called fates. For example, the Clear Sight fate will start the game with the entire map revealed, while the Mistworld fate keeps the fog of war shrouding the map for the entire game except for the immediate area around your armies. There aren't a lot of fates in the game right now, but I could see this being an area the developers might expand with DLC content. I found all of the game modes enjoyable, though for this review, I spent most of my time in the campaign. Something I found lacking was the game's exploration, and I think there's a couple of reasons for that. The first is because there just aren't enough interesting nodes on the map. Veterans of the Heroes of Might and Magic series know that these sorts of games typically present a busy map for the player to explore, full of dungeons and secrets, loot and quests, and interesting random encounters. But Songs of Silence doesn't really do any of that. The map is mostly barren. The only points of interest are the cities. I use the term city loosely here to refer to any conquerable node where your armies can rest and spawn new units, whether that be an outpost or a bridge or an actual city. They can all be upgraded to a degree and they simply become part of your empire, which ends up being a series of city nodes and not much else. So an empty map is one problem, but the other problem is how the game is constantly sending a stream of enemies to seize your choke points and cities. There's hardly time to rest and recuperate, let alone waste time exploring. There are a couple of opportunities during the campaign to go explore a region or a dungeon, for instance, but the game is balanced in such a way that it's difficult to find the time or manpower to do that. During the third scenario of the campaign, for instance, there is a dungeon one can explore in the southwestern portion of the map, but I found myself having to spend nearly all of my time defending multiple choke points with only 2 heroes and their armies, so I didn't have any time to engage in that kind of exploration. It wasn't until I had the map nearly conquered that I finally acquired a 3rd hero and felt like I could breathe a little bit, and by then I just kind of wanted the scenario to be over. The pace at which the game throws enemies at you and the limited range of your own armies, coupled with the need to heal, reinforce, and garrison units, makes it really difficult to do any extracurricular exploration, even if there were places worth exploring. Hand in hand with the lack of exploration, there is also a dearth of loot in this game. I know I'm beating a dead horse with the Heroes of Might and Magic comparison, but that's because that game basically defines this genre. And because it does, we players have become accustomed to certain features, like our heroes gaining loot to help make them even more powerful. As an example, the most recent game I played in this genre was Conquest of Io, and I absolutely loved how that game handled loot. There are a number of slots on each hero and tons of different loot options, allowing players to customize their heroes and adjust them to fit their playstyle. Heroes in Songs of Silence do level up, and they do get new abilities, but they have no loot, and quite often their level options are just upgrades to existing abilities. There are artifacts in the game, but these are represented as a type of loot wagon that takes up a valuable spot in the army's reserves. None of these artifacts are anything fancy either. The ones I discovered were hardly worth mentioning. Also, in the campaign, I found a card I could play to receive a new artifact, but there was a chance it would turn out to be junk. This seemed like an unnecessary design choice to me. There's no reason to punish the player with a chance to receive garbage when the artifacts themselves are already rare and lack impact. One of the things I did like quite a bit is how the game handles armies, reserves, and garrisons. Each city has a space for all three components. Garrison units stay within the city at all times, which gives a city a chance to defend itself, albeit a slim one, when an army isn't stationed there. Reserve units are a backline that seems superfluous initially until the player receives an ability that allows them to call their reserves into battle one at a time. That's when they become really useful. I found this to be a welcome feature and enjoyed using it quite a bit, and honestly, I felt like every hero should have had this ability to call reserves into battle from the start of the game. Building armies is a fairly straightforward affair, though because of the built-in limitations of the design, it can get quite disjointed when trying to put together mixed unit armies. As an example, each turn players can spawn new units into their cities, provided they have open garrison slots to house them. The units that can be spawned depend on the specific capabilities of the city, as well as a special building that can be placed on it. But the caveat here is that there can be only one of these buildings at a time, and if you decide to construct a different building to provide a different kind of military unit, that will remove the ability to recruit the old unit that the old building was providing. So in order to build an army with catapults and the powerful cavalry units called Ragesworn, for instance, you either have to have a city that can provide the catapults and a building that can provide Ragesworn, or you have to move your army back and forth between two different cities to acquire these units together. The Light Eaters DLC just came out and it introduces a new playable faction called the Light Eaters. From a mechanics standpoint, they operate a bit like necromancers with units that allow them to summon, leech health, and steal the health of their own warriors to summon even more powerful units during battles. This latter mechanic I found particularly satisfying to use. The Light Starved are a unit that during battle will pump out summoned units. These units by themselves aren't terribly powerful. However, when coupled with the Sacrifice card, their meager health is leeched and used to summon a more powerful unit. Mechanics like these are the kinds of things I love in video games. Something else the Light Eaters receive is the ability to recall an army instantly back to their capital, which seems like a feature that every faction should have by default, given how the game is designed. It becomes painfully obvious once you spend some time playing the Light Eaters and then try to go back and play with the base factions in the base game that mobility is an issue in Songs of Silence. In a game like this, where the objective is to spread out and conquer the map, there are really only a couple of tools that make that work. One way is to have the resources to amass multiple heroes and armies, so you can spread yourself out, hold choke points, and conquer additional cities. And the other is mobility. The factions in the base game lack the capacity to do either of these things well, but the Light Eaters at least have some mobility in the form of the capital recall. Overall, I found this DLC to be fun and a welcome addition to the game, and I hope it's a sign of things to come. Songs of Silence needs more factions with more complex mechanics, but also the base game factions could stand to see some improvements there as well. You may recall Han Solo's line from Star Wars when Luke Skywalker is dismissive of his ship, the Millennium Falcon, and Han shoots back, "She may not look like much, but she's got it where it counts, kid." Songs of Silence is basically the opposite of that. The game looks amazing, but it's missing it where it counts. The artwork is beautiful, the music is great, the voice acting is well done, and the user interface is sleek and polished, but exploration is lacking. There's no impactful loot to speak of. Battles lack tactical depth, and the pacing of the game is set up so that even if there was loot to be found, and the world was worth exploring, you wouldn't be able to do much of that anyway, because the non-stop stream of enemy assaults makes doing anything other than holding your own cities an exercise in frustration. That's not to say Songs of Silence is a bad game. I had fun playing it, but I just don't think it's where it needs to be yet. It needs more of the features that make these sorts of games really fun. It lacks depth, it lacks complexity, and it needs to be more fun and rewarding to explore its world. The Light Eaters DLC is a promising step in the right direction by giving a faction that has more complex mechanics, and it gives me hope that Chimera Entertainment will continue to improve the game over time. But as it stands, it just doesn't have enough of a hook to keep me playing for very long. So that's it, my review of Songs of Silence. As usual, if you dig the video, give it a thumbs up, leave your questions and comments below, and until next time, happy gaming everyone.